All right, our scripture today comes from 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 18, verses 1 to 5, and then skipping to 19, verses 1 to 24. It's found on page 448 on your Pew Bibles. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it successfully. That Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. And then skipping to chapter 19, starting in verse 1. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stay with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out." Jonathan spoke well of David to his father and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine, and the Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong by an innocent man, by killing him for no reason?" Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. Once more war broke out, and David went out and fought with the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the harp, Saul was trying to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, "If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed." So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair on the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, "He is ill." Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, "Bring him up to me in his bed so I may kill him." But when the men entered, there was the idol on the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, "Why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped?" Michal told him, "He said to me, 'Let me get away. Why should I kill you?'" When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. Word came to Saul, "David is in Naioth at Ramah." So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time, and they also prophesied. Finally, he himself went for Ramah, and sent to the great cistern at Secu. And he asked, Where are Samuel and David?" "Over in Naioth at Ramah," they said. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even upon him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his robes and also prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay that way all that day and night. This is why people say, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" Last week, we talked about a story called the Parable of the Drowning Man. The story goes that there's a man who's stuck in this really bad hurricane with tons of flooding, but he decides not to evacuate because God would save him. First, a boat comes and tells him to get away to save his life. He doesn't go. Then another boat comes. Then a helicopter comes, and finally, he just drowns. He gets to heaven and asks God why he didn't save him, and God says, "What do you want from me? I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter." What this story has to tell us is that God doesn't only work through miracles. Certainly God does work through miracles sometimes, and miracles are great because we come to a point where there's no other explanation except that God alone saved us. But that doesn't mean that it's God's only way of working. Instead, God often works in ways that we would say are normal parts of everyday life. Maybe God works through humans, like the ones that flew the helicopter to rescue the man, or who drove their boats up to see him. Maybe God works through things we could easily call coincidences. You get annoyed because you got delayed going out the door until a couple hours later you realized if you hadn't lost your keys, you might have gotten stuck in a giant car crash. You happen to hang out at a certain place for seemingly no reason, just because you feel like it, and it happens to be the way that you meet your future spouse. All of these things could easily be called coincidences. You could explain them as luck of the draw or roll of the dice. But that would be a mistake that is really similar to the one the drowning man made. You made the assumption that God only works through miracles, so that you say that if you can explain something as a coincidence or as the agency of a human or some other explanation, therefore you should. That just means that you could explain something without saying God did this. That means that God wasn't involved at all. I think this is a trap that we actually fall into more than any other as Christians in our culture. See, we have a lot of respect for science as a discipline, and we should, because science is pretty great. But the problem is that in order to do natural science, you have to rule out supernatural explanations. You have to rule out the possibility of explaining something as because God did it or because God said so. Now that sounds terrible until you think of the alternative. Because if you asked a science why plants can grow without eating anything, you wouldn't learn a whole lot if they just said, because that's the way God made them. I mean, sure, that might be true, but you're not going to learn much from a scientist if you use that as your answer for everything. For that reason, scientists have decided to rule out using that explanation, not because the explanation is wrong necessarily, but because it doesn't get them anywhere. When people say God did that is not a scientific explanation, they don't mean that science has proved that God did not do that. They really mean you can't use that explanation and still be doing science, because science cannot figure out what God is doing. Science has to rule out the supernatural, not because the supernatural doesn't exist, but because it is impossible to study it and still be doing science. Studying science is a lot like looking through a telescope. You close one eye to look through the telescope because it allows you to see things that you might not be able to see if you only looked through both eyes. You close yourself off to supernatural explanations temporarily so you might be able to see more natural explanations. But if you go around keeping one of your eyes closed all the time, if you're constantly looking through a telescope while you're driving, or while you're eating, or while you're doing the dishes, it's not going to work so well. You need your second eye sometimes, even if it's fascinating to look through the telescope. You need to be able to explain some things as being done by God, even if it's helpful sometimes to rule out that explanation temporarily in order to study natural things. On the other hand, sometimes people will say the existence of God has been proven false by science. These people are simply wrong. Science, as the study of natural things, can't say anything either way about supernatural things. Saying that the existence of God has been proven wrong by science is like saying that astronomy has proven that the only way to look at anything is by closing one eye and looking through the telescope. No, sometimes your second eye is actually useful. But you've confused the things you do to study science with the things that science actually says is true. You rule out the supernatural in order to study science, but that doesn't mean that science says that the supernatural isn't real. I say all this because I think it's really important for us to think about in a whole lot of areas of our lives. In our culture, we have a tendency to think smart people look for scientific, natural explanations of things that happen, while dumb people look for supernatural, religious explanations of things that happen. That's just a kind of a caricature of the way that the world looks at things, but it is more or less true, I think. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's a way of thinking that infects everything. I want to be seen as smart, so I'm not going to go around telling everybody all the things that God did for me last week, especially if I can avoid it. Even when someone says that a miracle happened to them, we kind of just assume that they're full of it, unless we have a good reason to think otherwise. This makes it really, really, really hard to genuinely believe that God is working in our lives. Because every time we think he does, we try to find any other explanation we can possibly think of. But we know that God is working in our lives. So why shouldn't we let ourselves see it when he does? Why shouldn't we encourage fellow Christians with stories of how God is working with us? So I talk about all this pretty much just to give us permission to say to each other when something happens in our lives and we're really excited about that God is at work, that God is using it somehow. We should have permission to talk, at least in the church, as if we really believe that there is a God who's active in this world. We should have permission when we see a rainbow to say, wow, God is so great for creating beautiful rainbows. And not just, would you look at how light refracts through the mist? How interesting. Because God is at work not just in miracles, but in every single thing that happens around us. When God came to the earth, he didn't do it simply spiritually, as just God. No, instead God came as fully God and fully human. In the same way, God works in the world around us in a way that is fully God and fully human or natural. You can say that you were delayed in getting out the door because you lost your keys because you didn't put them where you normally put them. That's a human explanation of it. We could also say that God used losing your keys to keep you out of a car crash. You could say that it was a coincidence that you hung out at a very particular place where you met your future spouse. But you could also say that God has led you to that space specifically in order to meet your spouse. Both of those things can be true at once, in the same way that Jesus could be both God and human at the same time. Last week, we talked about the downfall of Saul from a human point of view. Saul lost his kingship because he was insecure. He couldn't control his emotions. He was envious. He wasn't a good leader. And there were a lot of good lessons that we could learn from that human story. But today we're going to focus on the story of what God was doing through Saul's downfall. Because there were a lot of different things in this passage which you could totally explain by coincidence. But the writer of 1 Samuel wants you to see how God is working through them. But just like how in real life, there's no narrator floating above your head that says, as you're printing something out and the paper jams, God made the printer jam for exactly this reason. The narrator in this story doesn't say a whole lot about what God was doing either. So this passage makes for really good practice for our own lives. We're meant to look at the things that are happening in this passage and try to figure out exactly what God is doing without the help of an all-knowing narrator. Just like in our lives, we have to figure it out without a narrator over our heads, telling us why stuff is happening the way it is. See, last week we focused on a lot of the specific failures that Saul had as king. The ways that his own very human, emotional problems made him a really bad king who was doomed to be replaced by David. But there are a few ways that Saul is actually learning from his mistakes here. Back in chapter 13, Saul was very jealous of his own son, Jonathan. Jonathan was having a lot of success on the battlefield, while Saul was not. That meant that a lot of people had a lot of loyalty for Jonathan, but not a lot for Saul. So notice how similar these two situations are. David, just like Jonathan, has had a lot of success in battle, and David, just like Jonathan, is a threat that Saul might not be the one that's getting Israel's total loyalty. But in the first, when Saul was jealous of Jonathan, he found some trumped-up charge against him to have him put to death. It was a really bad move, because nobody wanted to have Jonathan put to death, and everyone knew exactly what was happening. So Saul has shrewdly decided here to do something totally different this time. He wasn't going to get the people to try and kill David. He was going to put him in a ton of dangerous situations in battle so he could valiantly fight for his king Saul. He was going to send him on a suicide mission. Don't come back until you've collected 50 Philistine foreskins. No, make it 100. That's impossible to do. David's toast. And if David died, and which he certainly would, nobody was going to blame Saul at all. It was going to be completely different. When Saul tried to have Jonathan put to death, everyone pleaded and pleaded with Saul. They would have blamed Saul if that had been the case. And Saul only gave up, and that made him look even more weak. In this case, they would have blamed the evil Philistines. And if David died in battle, he wouldn't have been a martyr, which gives one more reason that Saul needs to lose his crown. Instead, he would have died as Saul's loyal soldier. He would have been a model to everyone of what a really good subject looks like. Someone who fights and gives his life for King Saul in his war against the evil Philistines. Now, sure, we recognize that Saul wasn't nearly in control of his emotions enough to pull this off. He tried to kill David twice with his own spear, but you can't say that Saul is being stupid here. It was kind of a genius move. But here's the thing. Saul has been a very direct king so far. He's not been very clever, and that's worked fine for him for a lot of situations. Now he wants to try the clever thing. He wants to be the tactical genius. But it just doesn't matter. There's nothing that Saul could ever do that could touch David. And that includes when the genius 4D chess move doesn't work, literally taking a spear and throwing it at David himself. It was never going to work. As we know, every attempt to have David killed was doomed. Every attempt for Saul to keep his throne was doomed. David was chosen by God to be the king of Israel, and nothing that happened was going to stop that from happening. Saul was designated to lose his crown, and he could give it up willingly, or it could be taken off his head when his war against God finally destroyed him. Those were Saul's only options. Nothing that Saul could do to get his crown back was ever going to work. He had to give it up. So when Saul told David not to come back until he collected 100 Philistine foreskins, David came back with 200. When Saul married David off to his daughter to try and make nice with him, to try to say, hey, everybody, if you like David, you should like me too. He likes me, so you should like me. In the end, it was Saul's own daughter that saved David from being killed by Saul. When Saul said, no more waiting, I'm just going to finish David off myself. When he threw a spear at David twice, David dodged it twice. Saul has had hundreds and thousands of people killed in his life. He's used to understanding life as a fragile thing that he can snuff out with a word. But David is obviously different. Notice you could explain all of these things on a human level. There's a bunch of coincidences. David's just a really good warrior. All those close calls were a lot of luck. But I think we all recognized, at least in this book, that to call these a mere coincidence is just bad reading, bad interpretation of the Bible. The author clearly wants us to see God's influence in all these close calls and coincidences. David was never going to be killed by Saul, whether he tried these 4 different things or 4 million different things. But if we see that in the story with its human author, why don't we see that in our own lives? Why don't we give ourselves the permission to see God working in our lives? Isn't it bad reading of the story of creation to not recognize that the author of all of history is working through these coincidences and hardships and luck and human skill in your life, just as much as he is in David's? Because this isn't just an isolated story in the Bible. In fact, the author makes a few subtle allusions to plenty of other stories. Jacob was chosen by God to create the family through which God would save the world. And it becomes clear in Genesis that God's blessing meant that there was nothing in this whole world that was going to stop that from happening. And just like David, Jacob was betrothed to one woman before having the woman he was supposed to marry switched at the last moment. Just like David, Jacob's father-in-law angrily chased after him after his wife stole her father's cult statue. David, the author is saying, is like a second Jacob, someone whose story very closely mirrors Jacob's, and who, just like Jacob, was blessed by God, and nothing would ever take that blessing away. In chapter 18, it says that David had success in all his undertakings because the Lord was with him. And that's a pretty direct quote of the story of Joseph. Genesis 39 says, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a very successful man. Again, just like Joseph, David narrowly escaped death by luck and coincidence and chance. Just like Joseph, David rose to a place of power and prominence in a way that seemed inevitable, even though there were tons of people that actually stood in his way. What the author is saying is that David is not alone. God chooses the people he chooses, and when they remain faithful, there's really nothing you can do to stop them. And the author is right. There's millions of examples you could point to. The Egyptians recognized that the Israelites are growing in population, and it's going to be hard to keep them as slaves. But really, nothing they ever do was ever going to keep them. There just happened to be 10 really bad things that happened all as this Moses guy was telling the Pharaoh to let his people go. And believe me, this is true. I have seen people argue that all this was a coincidence. They find a scientific explanation for the 10 plagues. Which, sure, maybe there is a scientific explanation, but you're missing the point. God was working through those 10 plagues. And just like there was no way that God was going to keep David from the throne, there was no way he's going to keep his people from freedom. Or in Esther, when Haman has decided to get the king to kill all the Jewish people in the world, a whole bunch of things just happen to go wrong for him. The king just happens to have a sleepless night at just the right time. The old queen was dismissed, and Esther just happened to be made queen. The king just happened to walk in on Haman at the wrong place and the wrong time. You could say Haman is unlucky. You could say all these were coincidences. But when these things happen hundreds of times through history, all in favor of the blessing of those whom God has chosen, can't you see that maybe God has a role in it? Even Haman's friends, who knew very little about the Jews or about their God, said to Haman, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has already started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Saul couldn't stand against David, and neither could Haman stand against Mordecai. Or what about Jesus? Surely the demonic forces, the powers of evil and greed and corruption thought that death, of all things, might be able to stand against the one whom God has chosen. But even death was not able to hold the Son of God. But if Saul could not keep David from ascending to the throne, neither could death keep God's chosen king. If there was ever a time when it became obvious that God's blessing was all that mattered, if there was ever a time when it seemed impossible for the enemies of God to succeed in wiping them out, it would be when the Messiah actually did die, but he just so happened to be raised from the dead 3 days later. And we know that if God raised Jesus from the dead, he will also raise us from the dead. If God has made death his enemy, then death is in a position a lot like Saul in this passage. Death can either willingly give up its prey or it can be totally defeated. Because nobody will ever keep Christians in the grave since God is on their side. All of God's enemies, even death itself, is on borrowed time. As Hannah says at the beginning of this book, God guards the feet of his faithful ones because it is not by might that a man should prevail. Even after the Bible, we've talked about it in a couple of Bible studies, but in 363 AD, Emperor Julian the Apostate tried to destroy Christianity, in part by rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. He felt that if the temple was rebuilt, that would disprove Jesus' prophecies. But both pagan and Christian historians agree that this didn't work at all. The moment that work began on the temple, there was a massive earthquake and reports of the ground opening up and fire coming out of it. Julian just happened to die in battle a month later. Again, you could read these things as coincidences. There was an earthquake. Earthquakes happen. But that would make you a bad reader of the author of history in the same way that seeing everything as a coincidence would make you a bad reader of a novel. So what this means is, frankly, you should just join the winning team. It's pretty clear that God's blessing means that his church, as his chosen people, will never be eradicated no matter what the world tries. It's pretty clear that while being part of the church might bring you more hardship, it will give you a purpose in life that literally cannot fail. See, Jonathan in our passage had everything to lose and nothing to gain from David becoming king. As the crown prince of Israel, he was next in line to become king. But Jonathan recognized that God had blessed David and had chosen him to take Saul's crown, and Jonathan knew there was no point in fighting against God. Jonathan decided it was wisest just to join the winning team. If death can't keep Jesus in the grave, neither will it keep you in the grave as part of God's chosen people. So if you're not a Christian, this is the place the world is inevitably going, so you should probably just hop on board. Certainly don't place yourself in the position of Pharaoh or Saul or Haman or Julian. And if you are a Christian, remember that there's no real need to worry about whether you will succeed in your work for God. As long as you remain faithful, as long as you through prayer are consistently and humbly seeking God's will, you have nothing to worry about. Because as Hannah says, it's not by might that a man should prevail anyway. God's purposes cannot be thwarted by people actively trying to destroy them, so surely they also can't be thwarted if you forget to carry the one, or if you forget to do something someday. God will use every effort, every success, and every mistake for your kingdom purposes. The God who clothes the lilies of the fields in splendor and feeds the birds will surely feed and clothe the church and her people, for which he gave his own Son. And who, by worrying, has ever added a day to his life or to his church's life? Finally, what this means is that you have my permission, if you ever needed it, to see God everywhere around you. You have every right to notice that even if you could explain things without God, that doesn't mean God is not involved. You might interpret what God is doing wrongly, and we can figure out what God is doing together. But I'm telling you, God is at work everywhere. It's been true for the last 3,000 years, and it's not going to stop just because it's modern and sophisticated to say he's not. This is something that I know deep down, and have always been afraid to really believe. I myself struggle sometimes to really believe that I can allow myself to see God everywhere, even in things I could explain without him. But how much better would it be for me, or for you, for us, if I could see God at work in all areas of my life? And if I was able to give thanks for every weird coincidence, every lucky break, and every mistake that led to blessings in my life. Because we know that in all things, God works together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Let's pray. Great God, we have seen what you have done for our ancestors in the faith. So Lord, we trust that you will do the same for us. Forgive us for the times that we have failed to trust you and have instead substituted our own efforts and our own worries. Instead, give us eyes to see your work everywhere around us, so that we could give thanks for everything that you have done. Amen.